welcome to our author panel discussion on new beginnings. This is a panel of 4 regional authors from around Yorkshire. So this is brought to you by Promoting Yorkshire Authors. We're a group of regional authors who are who come together to sort of pool our resources and self-help in promoting our books and whatnot. So just so a few points about Promoting Yorkshire Authors. If you want more information on us, we have an open Facebook page called Yorkshire Author Promotions that anyone can sign up for. If you want to join our newsletter, you can go to our website and sign up. And if you're an author who wants to become involved, we have a sign up at Promoting Yorkshire Authors Facebook page, or you can sign up through our website as well. So this is September. It's for those of you who have children, it's back to school time, so it seems like a good time for new beginnings, probably the second best time of the year, perhaps. So we're having a discussion on how to begin your novel, how the authors approach sort of starting their novels and working on their novels. So Toni Bunnell?
Bunnell, yeah.
And you have quite a CV, quite a variety of jobs and interests you have. So you started writing fairly recently, and we'll get into that a little bit later on.
Yeah, just about
books now.
Yes,
so.
about 6.5 years ago actually. I'm really a singer-songwriter. That's the basic thing. And I just took up writing books about 6.5 years ago when a friend died, which sounds like really not the thing you do. But I went to sort of manic phase and started writing poetry, because basically songs are all poetry set to music. And then from then on I found I couldn't stop, and I got the bug for it. And I started writing stories, and then they became novels, and then they got, carried on from there. Yeah.
And so that evolved from your music then, basically?
Not at all, no, because I was just grief-stricken with losing this friend, like it happens to everybody. And I found just writing the poems came, naturally. And I do, which is totally not fashionable these days, or say the poems rhyme. It's not allowed, it's not acceptable. I realise that, I don't care. And so I just went to do that, and then carried on. So it's nothing to do with the music, it's completely different. And writing songs and writing novels, the inspiration is different as well.
Right. Yeah. As well. Which instruments do you play? A number of instruments you have listed down.
Yeah, I play on the folk scene, so I've played for many years really, for half a living for a lot of the time. So I play hurdy-gurdy. Hurdy-gurdy, not the barrel organ, which anyone can play hurdy-gurdy here, and dulcimer, guitar, bouzouki, things like that.
Then you're also a teacher for quite a long time.
Yeah, I taught at Hull Uni for 16 years, yeah.
And did that involve your interest then in wildlife biology, presumably?
Yeah, it's just as a wildlife biologist, yeah.
Because you have a number of
nothing
books
to do with music, nothing to do with writing.
There are a few books on hedgehogs as well.
That was just me, because I run York Hedgehog Rescue. So I just took up I started doing research in a completely different department to the one I was meant to be working in. I'd leave it and rush away, so I was totally doing it probably illegally. And I'd work in the lab, and so I did loads of ecology research on looking at hedgehog poo. That's got to be all gripped in the seat, isn't it? Yeah. Great hedgehog poo.
It's a prickly subject.
Yeah. Yeah.
We move on to John. John also has an interest in hedgehogs.
Oh, indeed. We feed them regularly. In fact, Toni and I have chatted online and in person about hedgehogs before. We have about between 4 and 8 coming every night into our garden. Our garden abuts what used to be an old orchard. It's now a very old sort of farm garden. And they love it there, and they keep coming through to us. The first thing we did when we moved in was put a hole in the fence so they could come in. And where we live is down a cul-de-sac, and there's very little barriers between the houses, so the hedges can move around, and they do. They're just fun to watch, and they don't have to make some noise, I have to say. They're not trainable or house, certainly not house trainable, that's for sure. But you get used to that as well. On the writing side of things, well, for over 50 years, I've had a long-held interest in doing family history and this sort of thing. And my mother's maiden name is Dumeric. It's D-U-M-A-R-E-S-Q, which is a Channel Island name. And it's very unusual. And because it's very unusual, it's very easy to search and trace and find. And any Dumerics that you find, they're somehow going to be related to me, or at least my mum anyway, somewhere along the line. Then there's none left in England or the Channel Islands now. There is still thriving encampments of them out in Australia and in Canada. And in fact, I have been in touch and been out to meet some of the Australian ones. But they left a great historic trail behind them, not at the middle of history, but on its verges and this sort of thing. And something I found, I had this family history that was full of quite disreputable characters, or again, just on the fringes of history and events and this sort of thing. No money, unfortunately. And some of them were absolutely awful. In fact, one of the main protagonists in my first book is actually my 5 greats grandfather, and he was a total, utter bastard. Only not that good. I mean, he really was vile, but great to write about, you know. And I've always liked historical fiction, historical romances, and that's what I do. I write historical fiction with a strong romantic thread. And first book is out, the second one hopefully will be out next year, which actually involves the next generation from this, the daughter from the first protagonists, who herself was, again, unconventional life. Let me put it like that. Fun to write about.
So, and Trev, so you're probably the furthest away from anyone here at the moment, the longest trip.
Yeah.
So you have a little bit shorter CV, but more concise, not so much information on yourself. It just mentions you're a keen golfer and a frustrated Middlesbrough FC.
Middlesbrough fan, yeah. We're about to kick off at 3 o'clock, so I don't think I'll get to Norwich in time. Yeah, so
you said you're an IT consultant as well for me. So that's a bit of a switch from an IT consultant to...
Yeah, I was in the RAF. I mentioned that. I was in the RAF for 9 years. I left the RAF and then did a couple of years working in a temping bowling centre as a manager. And then I ended up contracting as a trainer. So standing up in front of people, talking, teaching IT mainly. And that ended up being a career up until now. So I'm self-employed. I'm currently project managing for BP, I can say that, I suppose. But in London, so I'm in London most of the time. Live in Darlington with Claire, and we're home every weekend, just about, so we've got the commute all the time. But writing came out of the blue for me because I got an E in English at school. Borderline dyslexic. I'm sure I'm not allowed to say that, but there's no way I can't be, I don't think. Never been diagnosed. But my proofreader told me off forever saying that. She says, you just can't spell. So I had a dream 3 years ago. And I was on my own down London, and it wasn't really, I never ever went to sleep. It was nearly asleep. And then I was like, oh, that was a bit crazy. And I'd go I'd had some wine earlier on the night, but then I'd have a drink of water to try and get some sleep. Didn't sleep all night. I assume I got the odd half an hour here and there, but I had these dreams followed each other. So anyway, I thought nothing of it. Told someone at work. They went, "Oh my God, what a story that is," and did nothing about it. And then after we got to dinner with Claire with some friends and tell them about that dream you had. And it grew arms and legs. I couldn't remember what I dreamt and what, because I was filling in the gaps. And then it ended up January last year. We were at New Year's Day at your mum's, and there's some friends with us going, tell them about that dream. So I told them it all. And I said, I'll write it one day. And she went, do you know what, Trevor? You never ever finish anything you start, ever. I went, right. I will. And I got the laptop out, and honestly, I promise you, I've written technical documents, but I've never written anything fiction. And I just started, and I don't know, I wrote about 3,000 words in about an hour and a half. And it was a mess, but there's a story in there somewhere, so finished it off and self-published it. Right.
And tall, so I know you're the best of everyone in the panel, but you've had quite a career as well from engineering. And so how was that?
Originally I'm a chartered engineer. I'm a fellow of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. I've had a lifetime in IT, mostly data communications and IT. I worked for BT for a long time, but I don't often mention that. It's weird, but writing novels is very similar to writing software. With a piece of software, you start with a framework of an idea, and then you fill in the middle. It's very similar to you start a book with an idea, sometimes you don't know where the end is, sometimes you don't know where it's going to go, and sometimes it even has a life of its own, and that's very similar to software, incredibly similar. The thing I like about it is about writing is that it's all in here. In my case, I write fantasy, so I create the world as well as create the characters, but it's the characters I love creating the best. Having a depth of character, you almost get to know them. They've got their own personality. You get to know them. You know who they are, and when sometimes, if you get to like them, when they appear on the page, it livens up the novel. Suddenly becomes. I happen to like the dragons in my book, and I like the personality of the dragonalities, personality of the dragons. And when they appear in the book, I start to enjoy it.
It can be difficult if you want something bad to happen to them, I imagine.
Well, nothing did.
Nothing did, okay.
You protect them, you protect your characters, because I can remember before my book was published, someone read a bit of it and said, "Oh, I'm not sure I'm happy with his wife." I was like, "Are you slagging off her?" Like, I invented her. She's meant to be nice. I didn't actually change it, but the fact was, there's nobody there to protect them, you feel, and at the beginning, especially for me, because I've never done it before, when people say things like that, you're like,
No, she's not nice.
no, she's nice though. She's nice now. I've put some extra bits in to make her nicer.
So none of you have actually started in writing, which is interesting. I mean, through your jobs you've been writing, but you all came to writing novels much later. How did you find that transition? I mean, Toni mentioned it was sort of started with an emotional situation in your life, and then you progressed into novels, and so kind of caught the bug. I mean, how was that sort of?
Yeah, okay, so I had an Irish fiddler friend, we played in the sessions in Manchester for years, and he was telling me about this spider that lived in his ceiling in a crack that would like vanish and then it would appear again, and so I wrote some little story for him which I sent, and then I got thinking about this crack in the ceiling, and that led me into like a completely different world. So then I wrote a story, The Room Between the Floorboards, which I published as an ebook, paperback, and then later as an audio book. And the whole thing just came from that. I just go off into some little strange fantasy world, time out if you like, and I could just see through the crack. I could see what was happening. I once described it to a writer friend as dreaming while awake, and then I wrote another book called Dreaming While Awake, because that's what it's almost like. You can see the images, so you're awake, and you're not completely in a trance, but then if somebody touches me when I'm writing, I go a bit, leap about a bit. So that's where some of the ideas have come from. That was the original book that I wrote after the poems. Yeah. So, I'm sorry. I was
John. Say, John, you mentioned yours grew naturally out of your genealogy search, but you also wrote as part of your job before.
Oh, I did. I'm a ship's captain by background, but I spent the last 20 years not actually going to sea, but doing management job documents and preparing health and safety documents and procedures and all of this sort of stuff. And you learn how to write it so that people will at least read the damn stuff. It doesn't matter how good your manual is, if no one's going to read it, don't bother writing it. And that really does help you produce clear and easy reading prose, which I have found really very, very useful. It also gives you a facility for using documentation generally and this sort of stuff. So using a word processor or anything like that isn't frightening, as it is for some people who've never tried writing before. When I actually started with novel writing, I met a couple of then unpublished lady romantic novelists, now both very, very successfully published, and just through talking to them, they seemed really nice people, and we got chatting away, and they're now very much family friends. And you start to meet more of them and chatting to more people, and then the drip starts. Go on, John, you know you want to have a go. And eventually resistance is useless. And so you sit down, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to sit down and write. I'm retired, I'm supposed to have all this time. You make time and you literally force yourself to carve your story out. And you find, like I did, a basic story that really I wanted to write, and you make yourself do it. And I'm really happy with what I've done with it, I have to say.
I think that's an interesting point, John, because when you want to do something, you somehow make the time
You have
do
to.
it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So Trevor, then on that point, since that was your first book and your first attempt at any fiction writing whatsoever, how did you find the whole process? You mentioned sort of the beginning was quite straightforward.
Okay,
once you decided, but-
move on from the dream then, telling the story. So then I suppose I've got a story in my head, but when I wrote the book, there's 20,000 words before you get to the first bit of the dream. So that's me. I couldn't just start there. So I had to get to there. And that's when I first sat down on a laptop and just said, let's give it a go. Luckily, I teach Microsoft Word, I used to.
Yeah.
So I've got all the Microsoft skills in the world. The problem is, my spelling's that bad, which I mentioned you. It'll underline it in red and I'll right click on it and even Microsoft Word's going, I've got a clue. So I'll just change the vowels around if it gives me something. Yeah, I've got a good editor. But yes, so that was how it began, but how I started the book and got to that point. I didn't know if I could do it, and I've always been quite creative. I can always tell a story. I'm always good fun at parties, I suppose. So I knew I could tell a yarn. Whether I could write one or not, I don't know. And it was the hardest part was showing Claire and others the first few chapters to say, well, I'll give it a go.
Exactly.
Especially from my school days when obviously I was not very good at English. So it was thought putting something to be judged was difficult early on.
Yeah.
It was scary to the point where you're like, well, I don't know if this is any good. And then when I actually finished the book, I wrote 127,000 words. This is me being an amateur, obviously. The editor grabbed all of it, gave me 97,000 words back. Which went, what was all that about? Every time I walk into a room, I'd explain everything, and they're going, everyone would be bored of that. They just want to know what's going on, and then what's going on again. Explain it if you need it. If you don't need to have it there. And she's been fabulous. I mean, but she cut so much out. I'm writing my second book now, and I'd be very disappointed if she cut so much out because I think I might have got a little bit better. Having reading the first one, I read just before I started writing the second one, which was another dream, believe it or not. I read the first one again to realise how the bounce and the feel and the pace should be, because obviously I've looked back at the 127,000 words and the story's there, and it's just the bits in between that were slowing everything down.
It's like sculpting it out.
Yeah, it's just like take a long time to get a point across where you've got to think about the reader. Do they really want to go through all of that just to get that point when you could maybe get that point across a little bit easier? So I've learned an awful lot, but yeah. So it was having the bravery to a bit like everybody when you're first writing it down. When you first show it to somebody, you're like, go. It's like having your homework marked in public. Isn't it?
Yeah. But Paul, like Toni, you've written a lot of things in a large range of things. Some of your earlier stuff was travel books.
Yeah, well, I started writing way back in start of the millennium, I guess. The first book I wrote was a fantasy book, but it was actually a zany, humorous fantasy book, and I wanted the humour in it as well. And then we because I was sort of towards the end of my career then, I had a bit more time, and we started travelling a lot. So everywhere we went, I wrote a travelogue of it and some photographs in it as well. And that sort of got me into writing, really. It sort of got me into the style of writing. And then I wrote something that was really interesting, which is a World War II book, but with a twist. It's got a time slip in it. And I wrote it from two perspectives. It's actually called A Question of Resistance, Two Perspectives. And it's the same story, but told from two different people's point of view. The first one is a couple of young men who time slip accidentally into World War II in occupied France. And then the other one is the person that they meet as they time slip. And it's told from their different viewpoints, and they're quite different characters, quite different people. And I enjoyed that one a lot. I enjoyed what I really enjoyed actually was the research, rather like yours. I enjoyed the research in the book. You know, and the more you uncover what happened in World War II, and the more you see what's happening in our world at the moment, you know, the more horrifying it is that it could have happened. And I wanted somehow to get that message through in a format that maybe younger people might read as well. Because, you know, World War II must seem so long ago now. It must seem like ancient history, and yet it's very relevant to everything that's happening now. And I wanted to get that message across. And that led me into, my real interest, which is fantasy. I love fantasy, and I've written a 6-part series, plus a couple of prequels for that, set in Yorkshire. And that's the difference really. There are 2 parallel worlds. One is the Yorkshire we know and love, and one is a sort of a devil's world that intersects Yorkshire. And its time runs at a different phase than this one. So these people are through all the 6 parts of the series, but obviously these operate in our own time frame. So therefore, you get a different era with every book. And it starts off with Roman Britain, and bear in mind that York was one of the centres of the Roman Empire. And then it goes through to the Vikings appearing, and then other parts of Yorkshire history. It actually ends up with the War of the Roses, which happens to be one of the books that one of our members writes about as well. And it goes through the history of Yorkshire in the meantime. Now, I enjoyed writing that as well because although it's fantasy, there was an awful lot of real history in there with some of the minor historical figures. I enjoyed sort of researching some of the minor historical figures. The Richard III's appear in lots of different books, but the Queen Cartamandua doesn't appear in many books. It's quite interesting finding out a little bit about her and the fact that her original husband she ditched for the person who used to change his armour. Those kind of things are sort of things that you don't get taught in history books.
So you mentioned that fantasy was sort of your preference. So it seemed to take you a while to get to fantasy. If you look at your
I started with fantasy.
Oh, you did start.
My first book was a humorous fantasy, and then I veered off a little bit, and then I came back home.
Okay.
It's kind of the way I look at it.
I was wondering, because I was looking at your book list, and there's a lot of travel books.
I still like writing. I still write travel books, and I still like writing travel books because it sort of documents your life, if you like, and they're very personal actually. The travel books are very personal. The places I've been, with the people I've been at, and my own personal views of where I've been. And we some of you who drive cars may not like this, but we bought a caravan some years ago, and we don't have one now, but we have a motorhome now, but we had a caravan, and we decided that we'd do a grand tour of Britain. So we went right up to the top of Scotland, along the top of Scotland, and then right down to the bottom of Britain.
To annoy the whole of Britain.
I wanted to annoy as many people as possible, and I documented the whole of that, and my views of everywhere we went, and that's what I really liked about it. So you're right, we annoy absolutely everybody, particularly up in the north of Scotland where the roads are really narrow.
Yeah.
So Toni, you've written 11 books now, at least I have them in your bio, 11 books, but all seem to be in quite a variety of genres.
Completely different. We were talking to Paul before, trying to decide which genre. I haven't got a clue, some of them. A couple of them, Nameless Children and the sequel, The Dead Space, definitely fit into Gothic Supernatural, but the others, it's just as it comes into my head, the idea. So a couple of things that came to mind when Trevor and Paul and John were talking then. Okay, where the ideas come from in the first place. For me, they just come out of thin air. So for the Nameless Children, I was at the Bronte Museum in the grounds somewhere, and I saw the Nameless Children. I can't remember where I saw it. I've been back, I still can't find it. But from that, I had the title, and from then on, I went to think of what are the Nameless Children? They're the ones who were buried without a name, obviously, and they were buried in often vertical graves. And I thought, who were they? Who put them there? So the whole story came from that. Now, I don't have a plan. I have zero outline. For a scientist, it's quite pathetic that I have no plan. I don't. Sometimes I have the last paragraph, and once I've started, it just goes along. And with the Nameless Children, because they'd come back up from the ground, having been buried in the 1800s, and they were trying to take their revenge on the descendants of the people who put them there, I had almost 2 layers of time to deal with. So I just got a great big piece of paper, and I didn't even use an Excel sheet because I've not got a printer that big, and I just documented what I did as I went along and highlighted in different colours all the characters, and it just fitted together to make sure that there was consistency, continuity, etc. And obviously you ask lots of different writer friends to edit it for you and give the feedback honestly to you. And while we're on the subject of writing, I obviously use a laptop all the time, but I write longhand, and I buy these books I recommend them 4 for £1. Very good, very good value indeed. And I just write an illegible scrawl in City Screen Cafe every day. I have no friends. Everyone knows not to speak to me because I don't get a response when I'm writing. So, but if I'm typing, they know it's okay because I'm typing it up. And it was actually suggested that this is a really bad idea. It's time wasting. I don't care. I don't. What does time? I'm just doing it for the pleasure of it. I don't write for any group of people. I write for me. A bit selfish, but there you go. And out of the 11 books, 2 of them, because I run York Hedgehog Rescue for the last 28 years, and counting, I've written 2 non-fiction books, which obviously sell in the hundreds because they're non-fiction books and I'm known for Hedgehog Rescue and etc. So, yeah.
So do your ideas, because like I said, a wide range of genres, and none of the books sort of form a series or anything. So do the ideas just sort of come to you and just then sit down?
Yeah, I mean, considering I don't drink alcohol, I don't take mind-altering substances ever, and so I don't know. Obviously, I'm able to go into a trance-like situation quite easily, and the ideas just come, and I just write as they come. Yeah, so no plan.
And so, with the Nameless Children, for example, did you do much research for it?
Virtually none. My history, I had to drop history at school. I wasn't not good. So if there's something I would need to know about with the book now, I would look it up, obviously check, because you need to get your facts right. You don't want to write something that's wrong if it's incorrect. So I did know a bit about, from a course I ran for Leeds Uni at an ecology course that I ran. I was visiting the graveyards looking at lichen and taking the group round there. And because of that, I knew that there were guinea graves. That's where I heard about them, so I already had that knowledge that there were these graves and people would be buried in a shroud. So it's quite easy for them to come back up from the ground if they came back to life again because they've just got a shroud and not a wooden box to break their way out.
So I mean, sort of open to anyone. Along that lines, and we were coming to research your books, because John and Paul both mentioned about doing research as well. Do you sort of research it intently at the beginning and then start writing, or is it a bit of both? How do you approach the research for your books?
There's an awful lot of research material, particularly for anything, with historic connections. You've got a tremendous amount of research material available online and in various places and this sort of thing. But you'll start off trying to research the outline of whatever you've got planned for your book. The book can end up totally different, in fact. And as you go on, so you find that, hang on, how did that work? What could they do there? Now, my book's set mostly in Ireland in the 1740s. And you think, well, what do they eat then? What was the diet of the common people, etc.? What were conditions like? And all of this sort of stuff. It's not in general sort of, it's not taught in history classes in the UK. It's not in the general sort of canon of received history generally. You've got to go and look, but you can find it, and it's really interesting. It's quite fascinating. 1742 was the year of slaughter in Ireland, when they had one of these cold snaps came down and froze the rivers and basically froze the peat in the ground and in the stacks and all the potatoes, and 1/3 of the population of the country died, plus at least 1/3 of all the animals and everything else. Basically, this is 100 years before the Great Potato Famine that people know about. That's the famous one. But the bigger disaster, if you like, was actually 1742, and nobody knows about that. It's quite when you start looking up and sort of seeing where does it fit into your story, you think, well, you've got to include that. It would have affected the people that you're writing about, and things like that. Because the trouble with research is so damn much of it. It's so easy to get sidetracked and to do too much research. But you'll know when you're doing too much research. Your head will tell you.
That's an interesting point, that, because I usually start with a book. For the Shires of York, I bought from a charity shop actually the History of Yorkshire, about this thick it is, and I thought I'd use this much for the first part of it, and actually I used that much because there's just too much information in it. What happens is, because I'm more interested in the minor historical characters, what I generally do is use the big history as pointers to find out information about the smaller characters in history. And mostly what I've tried to do is pull out those people that you don't normally see in the history books. So.
I would say all of you so far mentioned you've written an element of history into your books. Mine's set in the modern day. It does have a time slip, but and then it goes into a bit of mythology. I had to get that right. So Google's your friend, isn't it? Especially when you're in IT. So I'll be in the middle of a paragraph and go Google something. My new book is called The Funicular, which is based on the Saltburn Cliff Lift. It's the oldest water balance cliff lift in the UK, with 260-gallon imperial tanks underneath it, and I didn't know any of that. Just Googled funicular Saltburn cliff lift, you know, and then all of that. It gives you credibility, doesn't it? Because when people are reading it, they're going, get that. The DB Aston Martin DB5 is in my book, my second one, and there's a whole conversation about this guy who loves cars, but he doesn't like tractors. And there's a tractor. He's got like a tractor museum, and at the back he's got this car, but he didn't show me yet. And the in the tractor museum, it's David Brown, and this guy's bored. He's going, look, I'm not really into tractors, cars are my thing. He said, well, do you not know that David Brown is the reason you've got a DB on an Aston Martin? And they're like, really? And then he pulls this Aston Martin DB5 out, and he said, well, David Brown bought Aston Martin and helped do this, that, and the other. And all of that, people when they're reading, I imagine, because it's now yet, but will go, didn't know that, and then they'll probably check it. Did you know that? And they'll tell someone in the pub, and I get a lot of facts like that from conversations at work and in pubs, and then you'll check them out, obviously, because there could be a load of rubbish and you don't want to put that in. But little snippets like that, I think, especially when it's not history. History's harder because you can't get it wrong. Whereas I think when you're dealing in the future, that Google's more likely, or Wikipedia's more likely to be right, whereas in the past you get different versions of history and you've got to do a lot more checking of your facts, I would imagine, than what I've had to do.
I went to Swanwick summer school this year. Brilliant, totally recommend it. Anyone here's to write it. Fantastic, 6 days, brilliant. Derbyshire, it's not down south or anywhere. So she is a northerner. I went to 4 separate crime workshops, how to write crime. And they were really, really interesting. And that, you really got to get it absolutely correct, every little bit. So the story I'm writing at the moment, I've totally opted out of that. It's based in the 60s. So you got no trouble with DNA analysis, but then I will Google it and check before I start typing, when I'm typing it up, just check exactly when the DNA became used by the police, and you've got that, and when were fingerprints, when was that brought in, how often it was used by the police. So actually going back into the 60s is quite handy. There's no CCTV all over the place. So I actually thought,
so I'm writing a modern, it's a modern crime novel. I've gone down the old detective story route, and I'm like, oh no, because you're going to have the procedural police out there telling me that
these were
wouldn't
4
happen.
separate sessions, and they just covered a bit of it. They were brilliant.
You can make really silly mistakes sometimes, you know, like one of my beta readers, I put in Viking times. There were some witches in the fantasy story, and I got them drinking out of china cups. And of course China didn't arrive until a long time ago. And he said, you know, how come they got these? I know they're witches, but how come they got these china cups? So I had to change that. And you can, and that's a really silly thing to do.
But you can. It's so easy, isn't it?
But we all do it. And say you sit there with the phone, you know, you just like, and you just check it in 2 seconds, can't you?
My editor said to me, she said, Trevor, something's been bothering me about your book. And I've been in the pub, she's a bit eccentric, she's in Windermere and she goes waveboarding. She's about 60 and I've never met her, but she's done all this work for me. And then she went, and I went into the pub the other day and spoke to the barman, and he's been the barman there ever since I've been in this pub. And I asked him, how much would a game of pool be in 1973, because my book goes back in 1973. And we all agreed it would be 10 pence, and you've got 50 pence.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been 50 pence. And I've also changed that Dean couldn't have paid because he would have had a new 10 pence, not the old 10 pence. So I went, thanks for that.
Yes.
Just change it. But things like that, you could easily forget it's a different 10p, but somebody won't. Somebody will read that and go, well, they couldn't have put that.
It's that attention to detail.
Exactly.
And there's always going to be someone who will pick it up.
So do you think that sort of modern technology, access to the internet, etc., has made this easier or harder for the writing? Like, for example, with crime, writing a modern or future crime novel is brutal because of all the different technologies. But for example, with editing or fact checking, do you think this has generally made your life easier as a writer or more difficult?
You'd have had to come here, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And now you don't. You can fix it in the middle of a paragraph. I'm sure back in the day they'd have stopped and thought, right, I'm going to have to go to the library tomorrow to check this bit out and make notes themselves. Where it's a lot easier, I think.
But John must have made your.
It did. I was able to do an awful lot online, but I actually, when I was sort of finished the first real near publication draft, so to speak, of the book, I actually went over to Ireland. Well, my wife and I went over. We had a holiday over there, but spent a couple of days in Mullingar, just sort of going around, making sure that I hadn't made any gross mistakes in what I'd written. There's no point in looking stupid unless you really have to. Simple things such as, if you're going along some of the country lanes there, which will not have changed in 250 years, when you're walking, can you see over the hedges, or do you have to be sat on a horse to be able to see over the hedges? And little things like that. But you need them in your plot. You can't say, I saw so-and-so walking down the road. Not down here, you didn't, Odd little things. The width of an Irish country road is 1.5 cows wide. Designed so a cow can turn around in the road. And actually, when they were being built right back in the day, several hundred years ago, apparently it's 1.5 cows wide.
That's really interesting.
So, just moving on to your sort of writing schedules, with a few people quite prolific and then a few more starting their second books. Maybe we start with Paul and move on. But what is your writing schedule like? Do you have a sort of fixed block you set aside per day, or do you write whenever you can?
No, I write every day, and I get withdrawal symptoms if I don't write. And generally I get up early, because I don't work now. I get up around about 6 o'clock most mornings, and I'm writing from 6 until 10 usually. And I have found that if I write later in the day, I generally edit. If I'm going to do anything, I'll edit later in the day. But if I write later in the day, I have to rewrite it, generally. So I'm much better in the morning. I'm a morning kind of person, and it suits me. So yeah, that's when I write. And most days. Very, very few days I miss.
I would, because I'm contracting down London, I made a point on the first book of having my hour lunch break and just writing for 45 minutes a bit, which is difficult, but because I've got my head in spreadsheets all day and doing various things on projects, and then I would just say, right, stopping, writing, and then hits 1 o'clock, stop in the middle of a paragraph, that'll do. And then on night time, I'll generally do it in blocks. I won't do it every day. Should do. If I was doing this for a living, I would do that. I would get up, because this second book I dreamt the other night and didn't sleep all night again, and had these extra bits of this plot I did, and some new character came into it, and couldn't get sleep, so I just got up at 5:30. I was playing golf at 9:30, and just wrote from 5:30, and I wrote, I think, about 6,000 words. Just get it out of your head. It'll be a bit of a mess. It'll need me to go back through it, but it's the story's just then unloaded and downloaded from your head, so you've moved it on. But yeah, I'm not as religious. I wish I was.
So with your lunchtime writing, do you find that it helps sort of break up your day? Is it a nice sort of break from the rest of the work?
Yeah, and everybody in the end knew I was doing it, so they would just leave me alone. Whereas
Toni and
Works.
What about you, John?
Well, when it's going, it can go really well. I mean, I've had days where I've been able to get 7,000 words a day down, and other days where I haven't done anything at all. It's almost as if the story will tell me when it's time to write. You get fallow patches. I've been having one for a while, but it'll come. I'm 30,000 words into the next book, and at some unstated point, and hopefully not too distant future, I'll be churning out the 3,000-4,000 words a day again, and then I'll work it up to about 100,000, and then knock it down to about 85.
Yeah, so I used to think that with the story writing, it would be much like songwriting. You go and see a film like Lion, come out and write the complete song down, go home, put a tune to it. And so I thought you need inspiration. Then I joined a creative writing group in Pickering for a few years and found that you can get a prompt and you can just sit and write. And everyone wrote. Nobody was sitting there looking at the ceiling, everyone wrote. I thought, okay. So basically my day is that you'd be really interested to know. Hedgehogs first, hedgehogs, ferrets, sort the ferrets out. And then if there's a phone call from York Minster, I'll go and collect a hedgehog which is on its last legs, and then in the afternoon I'll go to City Screen Cafe. I have my own desk, or table rather, in the corner. The clock went, so I've replaced the clock for them. I know them all personally, so they put up with me. And so I just write there for about an hour and a half. And so I get about 1,100 words a day written, roughly speaking, only because I decided to calculate it recently. I was curious to know how many words were in an exercise book and how many, so I write about 11 sides a day, and that's pretty much every day. Like Paul, every day. I don't wait for anything to come out. I just sit there, I drink loads of tea with gallons of sugar in it, and that's me for an hour and a half. And that just works.
It's interesting you said about the creative writing group, because I'm a member of Harrogate Writers Circle, and they set like competitions every now and again.
Yes.
And it's the prompt that you need to write something different. And I like it because it forces me to write something different. I've done some poems, for example, recently. I never written a poem in my life.
Right.
And quite enjoyed writing it. And so it forces you to do something different.
And
Is that what you found with the creative writing?
Yeah, I don't know about you, but when it comes to like prompts, if I have an idea, I just bang it down in the back of my very smart book, and just tick them off as I've done them. So it just gives me an idea, so that when I get there, basically, or I've got something to go with, or if I haven't got that, I look and read the last 2 pages of what I wrote the day before, and then it just follows on from there.
But you find sometimes you hear somebody say something on a bus, on the train, or in the supermarket, and you think, I'll use that.
Actually, no. I think I'm so much. No, it's not actually happened that. But I'm probably in my own little world too much. I don't know.
I get a new character. There's a barman in the first book, and I thought, well, who would he look like? And I used Claire's dad, and I thought he looked like. I even called him Dave, and I thought I'll just base him on him. And then when I'm thinking, what do he look like? I know what he looks like. I won't be inconsistent further on. So I generally. So be careful, you might be in the next one.
A disclaimer at the beginning, writing a new book. You've got the idea in your head, and then how do you sort of start getting that down on paper? How do you formulate the structure of it and whatnot?
Figuring out the story arc. Where are you going with the story? And sometimes that'll change halfway through. You think, hang on, what's happening here? Why do I need to write like this? And who am I telling this story for? And all of this sort of thing. But you need it. Your story has to go somewhere. And the married lived happily ever after. It might be boring and it might be quite like a lot of real life, but it's not a book. Something has to happen, and you've got to decide what has to happen, or when it has to happen, or what's going to give you that story arc.
Underneath the first book I wrote, I had this dream, and I wrote the bullet points down. And then I would add to them because that's a good idea, and that's a good idea. And so I would generally have a bullet and sub-bulleted list underneath where I'm writing. So if I ever have a good idea, I don't have to open anything else. Just go to the bottom and add a little bit if I have an idea. And on the latest book, I've done exactly that. I don't know if it's the right way of doing it, but I just have this is where I need to get to. So I roughly have an outline idea of where chapters are going to appear, but. Totally like yourself, in the middle of a chapter I'll go, no, I'll do this next, and I'll disappear off it. And recently I found, because we had to move desks at work, I found the first bulleted list I did for Room 119, the first book, and it's absolutely nothing like the book. So I sort of, this was the edges of what my first dream was like, and where it was going to go, and it didn't go there. But I wouldn't have even started if it didn't have somewhere to go. Yeah. So it just ends up where it ends up, doesn't it? No, that's the way
I do something similar to yours, but with a mind map instead of bullets. Because it's easier to tag things off when you go. And generally I have a beginning and an end, but I'm not quite sure what the middle's going to be. I usually know where it's going to go. Some of the things I've written have been more about the characters rather than the story. But sometimes, the reason that soaps are so successful is because they're all about character and not about story. I mean, there are some stories, but the real, the old-fashioned type soaps, like the Emmerdale or something like that, old Emmerdale, I don't know Emmerdale from. That was all about characters. Yeah. Sometimes it's quite nice to write.
Corrie was in its first days, Then there were real characters. Those of us who were old enough to remember Ina Sharples, Elsie Tanner, etc. Part of my formative years.
But if you're writing a story about, for example, about a Yorkshire town or something, well then it hasn't got a beginning and end really, because life hasn't. Life has got a beginning and end, but the timeline hasn't. Yeah. So you start somewhere and you end somewhere, and in the middle something happens, but actually it's about the way that characters interact with whatever it is that happens that makes the story.
Talking about, like, basically where does your story end? Because I say I don't have a plan, I just write. And I put together a collection of short stories based on the theme Trapped. And some of these were like 750 words, 650 words. Then one of them ended up being 10,000 words, which obviously came at the end. So I had it just went on and on, hopefully in an interesting way. But I had no plan in advance as to where that was going. But that actually hasn't been an impediment.
No. I never stop either. If I'm on the computer, I'll just right there, done that paragraph, and I never stop and think, well, what's next? Because I see it like a film in my head.
Yeah.
So the story's actually playing in my head like a film. So we go into a bar and they're going to have a game of pool like they did. I'm seeing right there, having a game of pool. So what do they do? You'd go there and they ask for a drink with me. So that big.
Yeah.
And I just see it exactly like a film. And a lot of reviews of my book have said it reads like a film. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but maybe my style just lends to that, I don't know. But I never stop, until I go to bed, and then I get back up and I'm like that again.
I often describe it as the story comes out of your fingers.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to hit the brain. You're doing this and it materialises before you.
Yeah.
But what I do actually sometimes is I might be just heading off to sleep when I go to bed, and I'll think, I don't like that anymore, I want to change that.
Yeah.
And then I go back and change it.
To anyone, everyone, do you have an inspirational author that comes to mind? Let's start with Paul and go down.
Terry Pratchett, he's my hero really. He takes logic to its extreme and then a little bit further.
Terry Pratchett, I've read, when I wrote my first book, I haven't mentioned this yet, when I wrote my first book I'd read 11 books in my life. That's all I've ever read. I've read 13 now. So my ratio of reading and writing isn't great. I'm trying to work out, I read 3 on holiday, but 7 of them were Terry Pratchett. So I would imagine there's a bit of Terry Pratchett in how I write. I'd like to think there was, but maybe there isn't. Yeah, Terry Pratchett definitely.
I was brought up on, because my dad was a fan, he used to pass them on to me when she was still alive and still writing them, the books of Georgia Hare. Georgia Hare is really well known for Regency romances and this sort of stuff. But some of her history books, the one she did about Waterloo, the infamous army, and also the one she did about Harry Smith and the Peninsula Campaign, called The Spanish Bride, are absolutely fantastic. An infamous army was actually, it was on the shelves at Sandhurst as a textbook for many, many years. It is so accurate. As my great-great-grandfather was actually at Waterloo and fought at Hougoumont and was injured delivering a dispatch to Wellington, I feel quite sort of proprietorial about it. That hopefully will be book 4. Yeah.
It's a book that didn't actually inspire me to write anything particularly, but I read it recently and it was quite an unusual book. It's by Laura Segal, S-E-G-A-L, and she was, at 10 years old, was evacuated on the kindergarten transport from Germany and arrived in England. And she wrote a book not many years later, after, I think she was like about 1920, she started to write the book called Other People's Houses. And I particularly liked this book because she said afterwards, she'd written at the back that she'd filled in the gaps. Obviously she was 10 years old, you could have quite a good memory at 10, she was very bright, but she filled in some gaps, and so she's written it as a novel, and I really liked how she'd done that. So it didn't inspire me particularly, but I wanted to share it with you because it was a really great book and an unusual stance that she took.
And my last question then is, what's your latest new beginning? What are you working on right now?
It's actually a criminal element. It's 5 children, or they are 5 children who are in the 60s, because I'm cutting out the CCTV and the DNA analysis bits, but that will kick in later. So they're getting up to no good, but in quite a not a good way at all. They've got a really dark side to them. I worry about myself, so I think maybe I'm not mentally quite right. So I'm quite a long way into it. I'm on what's this now? I'm on book 12, exercise book 12. So that's what it's about.
They'll be worth millions one day. Then.
Yeah, these exercise books. Yeah, they apparently, if you ever worry about losing your copyright to something, the best thing to do is to keep your exercise books, if you've written them in that, and if not, keep them somewhere. But that's by the by. But anyway, so it's to do with crime and 5 children.
Well, my next one is, I said, it concerns the daughter of the chappie on the cover there. So my great-great-great-great granny who was the daughter of an Irish peer and married the son of another Irish peer, and became Jane Lady Lanesborough, and lived a very conventional life, having a quiver full of kids back in Dublin, until after about 12 or 15 years of marriage, decided, stuff this, I'm going off to London to live the high life, and abandoned her husband and the 3 eldest kids who were already married, and took the 3 youngest ones with her and went off living in London, where she actually had a formal deed of separation drawn up and signed on her behalf, because women couldn't sign anything in those days. And her husband made her an allowance until, unfortunately, he died. And while in that sort of 5-year period, she met and got involved with a guy called John King, known as the Jew King, who was the younger son of a family of unofficial Jewish bankers active in London in the sort of 1780s. And John King made his money doing dodgy loans, or broking dodgy loans, for the younger sons of the Irish peerage, so they could carry on racing horses and playing cards and living the high life in London. And he was 15 years younger than Jane, and they were together for 40 years and died in the 1820s, living in Florence. But they were all over the continent, from day to day. Some days, over for a course of a few months, they'd be rolling in cash, and the rest of the time they're carrying everything on their back. And again, it was all sort of working on the periphery of history. They knew Emma Hamilton when she was in Naples. They just had to skip Naples, owing money to everybody, including Emma Hamilton's cook. See, it's little things like that, but great to write about.
My next book I've already mentioned is called The Funicular. But go back to the first book. It was someone from Whitby, Yorkshireman, being in London, and being very proud of being from Yorkshire, not putting up with the London life a little bit. There's a bit of that going on. This one's about a Londoner who moves to Saltburn. This is a detective, and he's sort of put too many rotten eggs away in London as he's been sort of going to work his retirement. And it's how he blends in, but then what happens, he stumbles upon a missing person from 6 or 7 years ago. And then the funicular cliff lift is quite important, because there's things happen and he sees things from the past, and he connects that there's a connection with extremely high tides and ley lines, and then how and then when there is a high tide and the ley lines sort of kick into action, he sees a projection of the past of somebody else being taken, and then he connects that the person 7 years ago, and there was someone else, and every one of these high tides a charge was taken, and he's sort of the only one who's in amongst this. He gets a young copper involved, and gets him helping him, but yeah, I'm scared to death of the procedural police going, well, that wouldn't have happened. So I think the more the fantasy element is in there, makes it easier for me to ignore a little bit of the, I'm not pretending it's sort of all the DNA and everything, but there's a lot of things happening, and because of that I can sort of make my own rules up. I've still got to be really careful, so I'm not looking forward to that bit. I'm about 68,000 words in, and my editor's booked for the 8th of October. Ooh. That's why I'm writing 6,000 words in the morning at 5 in the morning. So, it'll be done.
But I've done a little bit of a departure recently. I write under a pen name. I write under Joseph Murphy James. All of those names are family names. And I've just finished and edited, and it's actually on Amazon at the moment. A book about a town in Yorkshire, and it's the kind of things I was talking about earlier. It's about the characters in the town. There are things that happen in it, and also it's aimed at a different market than what I normally do as well. It's aimed at women readers mostly. It's all about a particular set of people in Yorkshire. And there's a thread of an incident that happens that runs all of the way through it, and which is solved somewhere near the end, of course. And I'm going to write the sequel to that. In the middle of all of this, there's a romance happens, and the couple go off to Australia, and because part of the thread of the story runs to Perth in Australia. So what I want to do is follow them in the second book, and then link that back to, it's called Harrogate, the 4 seasons of Harrogate.
Most of the author information and books are also available to learn about on our website. You go there, promotingyorkshireauthors.com.
Two or three of you have mentioned a book length. I mean, do you find a novel for any of you has a natural length, or do you have to be ruthless because your editor or whoever's publishing says 90,000, no more, no less? How does that work?
Well, Amazon has some limits on specific sizes for books that they want and they will publish in terms of different sizes. You have to have 55 or 50,000 words to be accepted as a book by Amazon,
Right.
At one particular price band, and then they go up.
Right.
But there's some sort of like received wisdom. Your first book in whatever genre is, your first book should not exceed either depending on the genre, generally 80,000 words. If it's historic, 90,000 words.
Right.
Mine started out at 100,000 and I slashed it down to 90 because of that. And then my publisher, because I'm with one of the very small publishing houses, my publisher turned to me and said, right, we want you to take another 5,000 words out of it. So it's dictated to you, and this is what the market will bear. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, there are some real traditions. Old style Mills and Boon books were always 174 pages long. And they would change the typeface to make them 174 pages long.
I was going to write until the story finished, and that's why I wrote 127,000 words. But when it came back at 97, I was quite pleased because there is. I googled it a little bit, and apparently the sweet spot for you get different sizes of sweet spots for different genres, and a mystery thriller or a psychological thriller is generally around between the 90 and 100,000. You don't want to be going too long with that type of thing. You want it to finish. You want to read it on holiday. A lot of people read like The Couple Next Door and that on holiday, and you don't want them to be, too much like hard work. That's what I read, so I was quite pleased when she put 30,000 words out of a book.
And that's what I read as well, that more and more people now, with our fast pace of life, they were quite happy to have short stories or novellas. Basically they're quite happy to.
I've read one or two authors lately, mainly in the fantasy. They publish as novels, but they're actually 3 connected novellas. Which I rather liked. I got to the end of one story and thought, well, it seems to have finished. What now? And the next one, it was you could say there were acts in the same story, but there were separate stories, but linked. And I did rather like that because, like you say, you can divvy it up. So I've got 120 pages. That'll do for the flight, and I know I'll finish it.
If you're in self-publishing world, I'm on quite a few Facebook sites as well because I'm self-published. I mean, if a publisher approached me, fair enough, I'd obviously think about it and do it. But because of that, a lot of the ways of making money in self-publishing is by having a series. So if you have 9 books, then you can give your first book away for nothing because you're trying to hook people into the rate, aren't you? But whereas mine isn't, it's tied up in a nice neat little bow, and you're thinking, I can't even put a sequel on that. So I couldn't do it. But I'd think about that in the future. I'm sure in the fantasy world it's more accepted, isn't it?
Mine is a series, and also I've got 2 prequels, and generally I give the prequel away. And as a result of which people will buy, and if they like the prequel or the first in the series, really, then they'll read the rest. And also, my intention was actually to only release them as ebooks to begin with. I don't actually. I also introduced paperbacks a year and a half ago, and it surprised me actually that I'm getting 50-50 sales of paperbacks and ebooks, and I expected the ebooks to be the highest. And with ebooks, there's not quite the restrictions on the number of words, because you're not printing them. Right? The original restrictions were about the cost of printing. That's what it was really about. 80,000 words was reasonable that the publishers can make a reasonable amount of money on. Anymore, you couldn't. Well, that's not the case with ebooks. And also, print on demand means that you can actually, you can do a much shorter book if you want to and make it into a series. My fantasy books generally are around 50 or 60,000 words.
I do what's known apparently as extreme self-publishing, because I'm a bit masochistic, extreme obviously. So I do the whole lot. I format it. I do the covers, which you're meant not to do, but book manager of a bookshop said go with the covers, Toni. they work for me, so I took her at her word. So I do the whole lot. I do lay the money up front. It doesn't go to Amazon, it's not in a warehouse. I deal with a short run press in Exeter. I send them the files, it comes back, as one's just come back to me yesterday, unbound. I go through it, so if it's like The Name Was Children, which has got 330 words. Pages, not words, that wouldn't be good, would it? And it takes me about 3 weeks.
Word a page.
Yeah, words a page, very big though. Very big. So I do that, and I have a fascination for flaps. Apart from one book, they all have flaps. I totally love flaps. Don't ask me why. I really like them, and I like the matte laminate finish. So the whole lot, basically, it goes email to obviously transferred to electronically to the printer, and then it comes back and sits unbound.
Did you do that with your first book? That I know on your 6 you're doing. Obviously, you started like that, and you just
I did have a self-published when I was teaching at Hull Uni. I did actually self-publish a book on music therapy because I worked for 5 years with people with learning disabilities doing music sessions. 3 a week for 5 years, and then it got. I sold loads of them. They got picked up by a publisher, and they sold loads, but I didn't get much money, so I was not too impressed by that. So after that, every single book has been self-published and put together by me and sent to a printer. So it's not any of these other things. That's just my choice. I'm not saying they're not okay. Everyone has their own way of dealing with things, but I like to have total control over the process. And I found an excellent printer who'll do the job. And it's short run. It's a short run press. And obviously, the more you have done, the cheaper it is. But I always cover my costs, and with the hedgehog books I sell, it's hundreds. So I'm well into profit, which pays for the hedgehog food. Which you don't really need to know, but there you go.
Well, they eat a lot.
Yeah, and so that's the way I would do it. So if you want to have a look just for the formatting and have a chat later, I'm happy to do that.
Do you think it's a good idea to join a creative writing class? They run them.
Yes, exactly. It's a great idea. I really would do it. And if there's any doubts at all, you realise you can write, and if you're with other like-minded people, it just gives you that the boost. And people who aren't judgmental, not people who are there sort of put one over on you or ego boost themselves. Yes, I would do it.
You can go on holidays as well, can't you? Where you don't know anybody, and you can just go on the holiday where you're all in the same boat and you're all starting together.
Writing retreats and this sort of stuff. Yes.
And I joined Harrogate Writers Circle for just that reason, in order to meet people who write, because I read a lot. You don't often meet, pro Yorkshire Authors is unusual in that you meet a lot of writers.